Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by Jowett, and he's the Climate Change and Sustainability Research Fellow at the Sheffield Institute of Education Research and Knowledge Exchange at Sheffield Hallam University. So, hi, Lee.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for inviting me and that extremely long title that I seem to have.
Yeah, it was a wordy one, that. Um, so you have actually been involved in climate education for a very long time, in a whole series of different kind of guises almost. Did you want to share some of that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career as a secondary science teacher in Sheffield. And that was, I guess, where I got my interest for sustainability and education. So in the school, two schools, in fact, I ran sustainability and the Eco Schools program. So that was really interesting. That gave me a really good grounding of kind of working with young people. I then changed careers and then worked as a sustainable schools manager in Leicester. And that was on a much broader scheme, really, of working with about 120 schools. And that really was interesting in terms of things from solar panels on roofs right through to working with early years practitioners on kind of developing outdoor spaces. And then again, kind of about 12 months ago, changed again. And now I'm an academic researcher at Sheffield Hallam within the Institute of Education, really looking at kind of the really key interesting bits around education and sustainability.
Yeah. Well, do you want to go into a bit more detail about the kind of current research and the projects and things you're involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, there's kind of two really key things that I'm interested in. One is, what does quality climate education look like in its broadest sense? So is it localized in terms of that approach? Does it go beyond the curriculum as well as within the curriculum timetable? Do we make sure that we're linking to young people's personal, family, and cultural experiences? So, for example, one of the things that I'm looking at the moment is tiny forests. So they're, like the name suggests, small tree planting schemes, but it's very much about engaging young people in their nature in their local area. And the other bit that I'm looking at the moment is, how do we enable practitioners to have really good subject knowledge and the confidence to teach climate change? So at the moment, I'm working with some of our colleagues in the Institute around some of our teacher training programs and making sure that there's opportunities to learn about climate change, whether you are a science teacher, maths teacher, or an early years teacher. So lots of opportunities that I'm working on at the moment.
Do you want to go in a bit more detail about that local context? Because I think that's something that's really useful for any educator anywhere, is to really be conscious of that local context.
Yeah, so I think the first bit is, it's really important that you understand the big picture of climate change and sustainability. But for young people, I think in particular, having that local context is really important. So quite often young people perhaps only will go to school and they'll visit a park in the local area. And for them, that is the area where they can perhaps have the biggest influence. So for me, it's around creating that agency to take action on a local level. And we do know from research that's out there at the moment that where young people have got eco anxiety and concerns, taking that action on a local level does help alleviate that. I suppose the other bit as well that I think is important is that we get better buy-in from when you see sort of the local co-benefits. So it might be cleaner water, air, nature. It might be nicer spaces to live, and potentially improving physical and mental health. So again, a really good example I've seen is things like Sustrans and Living Streets, where children are really taking some practical action around things like clean air zones and making sure that cars are not outside the school grounds. And that does create, obviously, some of those co-benefits and creates that agency that quite often I've seen a 10-year-old walking up to a window, knocking and saying, "Can you turn that engine off, please?" And quite often, well, nearly all the time, that adult's kind of quite surprised by that and will do that. So I think that's really important to me.
It's interesting as well the role that young people can play in often being a relatively kind of neutral actor within that. So when they take climate action, it doesn't feel quite as confrontational. And actually, young
Mm.
people, sorry, anyone who engages with those young people, my experience is often the response is often much better when it comes from young people. I don't
Mm.
quite know why, or kind of, yeah, there's a
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's almost that slight shock value.
Mm.
So adults expect other adults sometimes to challenge them, whereas, like say, a 10-year-old in a high-vis jacket, there's also something quite jarring about that, which kind of creates that action as well. I think that's part of it sometimes that I've seen.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess the bit you're referring to as well is that it's really important to encourage young people to be part of collective action. And I wondered if you could have had any more to say around that, and also maybe some examples of things you've experienced or been part of.
Yeah, it's a really interesting bit, and it's an area that I'm still considering and thinking myself, because certainly as a teacher, when I first started teaching in 2004, a lot of the work that I did with young people was about taking individual action. So things like sort of litter picking, or it might be individuals. Certainly, I know when I used to do assemblies, we talked about kind of recycling and um, lots of activities that were very about individual actions, which I think for young people are really important because they need that sense of agency that they can do something. And certainly, me as a young adult myself, I used to take action as an individual, but certainly over the last few years, I've kind of thought about that, and we need to, I think, move away from individual action to that collective action approach. Um, the bit for me is, when do you do that with young people? So it's getting that balance between that collective action that we know is what we need to be doing more of, whether that's as a whole school, let's say, reducing the amount of plastic we use, or it might be an influence in the leaders in the school or within a business that the school works with. But I'm not sure at what point do you introduce that group action, and go from what I suppose is reducing that anxiety of individuals going out litter picking to then practically working as a collective to influence going forward. And I think that for me is perhaps something that as practitioners we need to think more about. How do we then change that narrative from individual to group action? Because as individuals, yes, there are some individuals that will have big influences on the world, but in reality, it's us collectively working together that I think is important. So, for example, I know I worked with a school a couple of years back where we were looking at a campaign around the amount of waste that the school was using. And rather than us individually talking to students in the school, we actually went right back to the companies that were providing materials to the school. Particularly the dining room was the big one, and saying, well, how do we change this at the source? And some of those things did happen. Some of the bigger things did change over time. And I think for me, that's the important thing now. It's around collective action rather than individual that will make that long-term difference.
I think it's interesting as well, that idea of collective action. It comes at different scales. So the idea that you do it at maybe even a class level or a school level it feels more manageable as well, rather than like the next step, which is then, I don't know, bigger communities and I don't know, like a region, if you're then thinking about, yeah, kind of even bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, that can be quite daunting as well for a young person of suddenly I've got to change the world. Whereas if it's a group, whether it could be the eco committee, for example, in a school, that collectively they're taking that action, it feels slightly less scary. And working with adults and working with other people, it becomes less daunting, I think, for them to feel like all of that pressure is on them individually.
So just to sort of finish then, you've got all of this experience in all these different areas. Is there one piece of advice though you think you would be a really good starting point for teachers?
Yeah, I think for me, it can feel quite lonely when you are that one voice in a school or one organization. But I think certainly from the networks that I've worked with, which quite often now are virtual networks, there's lots of like-minded people out there, and there's that whole sort of mind hive around sharing ideas. So you might come up against one problem in your school or your setting, and think, right, how do I get over this barrier? But actually, it's kind of these online forums, these other groups, there's obviously other people within your school or your education setting who probably have come across this problem before, they've worked out a solution. So I think for me, it's about finding your allies and working together to take some of this action. Because a bit like young people, us as adults probably feel quite anxious sometimes, or we feel like, oh, that's another thing I need to try and deal with. But actually working together and working on shared goals and values, I think for me is the really thing is, yeah, find your allies, find the people that can work with you, and you will make that difference and that action that you're trying to achieve.
So kind of, are there any examples of ones that you've kind of connected with before in terms of networks?
Yeah, so certainly things like the local authority. I mean, I'm talking about my work in Leicester in particular, but quite often we would link schools together. So you might be saying, look, in our school we want to sort something out about active travel. We want to make the road safer outside. And you think, as an individual or as a group of teachers, what can we do? And it might feel quite limiting, but if you then talk to the local authority, quite often they will have officers that have targets where they need to work on some of these things. So for me, working with your local authority officers, whether they're kind of the nature team or the biodiversity team, or it could be an active travel team, I think they're really helpful because they've got the knowledge, they've got some of the ideas. I think the other one as well is if you're in a multi-academy trust, quite often I'm now starting to see where we've got the Department for Education strategy and it's talking about climate leaders and action plans. Actually, some of that is now coming from trust central teams rather than from individual schools. And I think for me that really strengthens some of that work because again, you're not working individually, you've got a group of a team that's working together. So for example, I'm a chair of a multi-academy trust in Leicester and we've got a sustainability strategy and we have eco leaders in each school, but they regularly meet. And we also have our business leaders that meet together to share ideas, tackle some of those problems. So that's the other thing as well. Talk to governors, talk to your trustees, because they are accountable for the school or for the trust, and they will make some of those changes when you suggest them. Really.
Great. I think that's a really good piece of advice, especially the local authority bit as well there,
Mm.
because it kind of reinforces that idea of local response as well, because obviously there's nuances within the local authority and within where you live, and obviously the local authority maybe are the experts often, understanding those. Yeah.
Mm.
W- Thank you so much, Lee. It's been a really good, like, short snippet, and we're really looking forward to seeing all of the outcomes of the work you're doing in Sheffield and with the university.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And yeah, I think this is just the beginning of my time of working at Hallam. So there's lots of exciting ideas and projects we're working on at the moment, both sort of locally and nationally. So yeah, really looking forward to sharing some of those in the future.
Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.